Welcome to the Arabesque Sewing Studio. Now in this video I'd like to talk to you about binding basics. Now binding is simply the term we use to refer to a strip of fabric that's used to cover the raw edges on another fabric, and it has many applications. So in arabesque patterns I use binding all the time, and it's really great for finishing off the edges on projects that have lots of layers. It's really great for putting on the edge of a flap or adding an accent to a handle. There are so many applications where you can use it and make your project really pop. So today I'd like to share with you the 3 sorts of binding that we use in arabesque patterns and the various applications where I use it, and also why binding is such a great skill to have in your sewing toolbox. So there are 3 main sorts of binding: single fold binding, double fold binding, and double fold quilt binding or French fold binding. So all of these can be cut on the grain or on the bias depending on how you want to use them. So single fold binding has 2 folds where the raw edges come and meet in the center. Double fold binding is really a subset of single fold binding, as it's the same except it's then been pressed a second time so that there's a fold in the center and you end up with 3 folds. And double fold quilt binding or French fold binding is simply binding that has been pressed down the center so that the raw edges meet together on one side. Typically when this was first used, this was used in clothing for necklines and armholes, and this would have been finished on the inside of a garment as a facing to give a very low bulk way of finishing the garment, so you wouldn't have seen it. Today when we use it, we will commonly fold it in half to make double fold binding, and this is a way of wrapping around the edge of a project and finishing with less layers while also giving a very nice finish to the seam. So double fold quilt binding or French fold binding is the most common one that you'll see used in binding quilts today. So when this is used to bind a straight edged quilt, you will just cut it on the grain, fold it in half, then the raw edges are placed on the quilt sandwich, sewn along the edge, and then wrapped around to the other side to bind the project. So you can see here on this arabesque project I have used single fold binding and simply plonked it right on top of the base, and I've used it to cover the raw edges of the needle keeper here. This is a really pretty way of just covering up some raw edges, and it's not the edge of something, but it is used as an edge finisher. Now when we want to bind the edges of a curve, we will make sure we're cutting bias binding so that it is stretchy, and this is where you get to choose whether you want to use single fold binding that has been folded in half to make it double fold binding, and you would simply open this up with the raw edges together, sew down that side, and then flip it and fold that over so that all the edges are encased and everything is nice and neat. Now my favorite way to finish the edges when I'm binding most of my projects is what we call the double fold quilt binding or French fold binding. So this has been doubled. When I'm binding anything that has a curve, I will make sure I'm cutting it on the bias so that it's got a nice stretch, and then we simply place that so the raw edges are on the raw edges of the project. We stitch down the recommended seam allowance and flip that over until this is covering the other side. So you can either do this on the front of the project or on the reverse, really depends on what your finished look is going to be. So I do recommend that you learn how to make both straight and bias binding, and that you practice how to apply it, because it does just open up a whole new world of possibilities of projects that you can make, and an infinite number of ways you can customize them to be just your own personality.